Rich is a former Navy officer and veteran of the First Gulf War, and his company, Richard Sherman Photography, operates as a certified veteran-owned small business. Rich book and the topic of today's conversation was inspired by a story told by a cab driver in Vancouver, Canada, who told Rich that he had been a Ukrainian soldier fighting with the Russians against Nazis in World War II. The man was grateful to Americans and he was still amazed why, he asked, did Americans come thousands of miles to fight a war when they didn't have to? When Rich left the cab, the driver also got out of the cab and shook Rich's hand and say, I want to say thank you to America. It is this experience that struck Rich and found himself trying to answer the question, how do you thank somebody you never met? This quest led him over the course of 5 years and 8 trips to 3 continents to visit 23 World War I and World War II military cemeteries to create this remarkable book of compelling photographs and to tell the stories of some of the men and women who lie in those distant cemeteries. The book about which we're speaking is going to be available through our website at shop.abmf.org. And Rich has been kind enough to work with us so that can be offered to our supporters.
Thanks very much, Jim. Yeah, the Somme American Cemetery is the first cemetery that I had a chance to visit, and this 6-year journey of gratitude took me to, as Jim mentioned, 3 continents and 8 trips. And you embark on a journey like this, and you start out, and there's so much you don't realize that you're going to learn in the process. And the Somme American Cemetery, to the north of Paris, a couple hours north of Paris, is a World War I cemetery. Some roughly 2,100 to 2,200 of our fallen heroes are memorialized there. And I use the term, you'll hear me use the term memorialized. And Jim, of course, you're very familiar with this, but there are a number of interments, some 1,700 plus 1,800 roughly interred at the Somme, and there's another 300 or more than 300 that are on the walls of the missing. So when I use the term memorialize, that reflects both those who are missing as well as those who are actually interred. And the Somme American Cemetery is just a gorgeous cemetery, just an extraordinary cemetery. Sometimes I think the World War I cemeteries, Jim, are a little bit more accessible emotionally, because when you start to get into the thousands, 10,000. We'll talk about some of the bigger cemeteries here in a moment, but plus it becomes just emotionally overwhelming. And to start here at the Somme was a very intimate cemetery, relatively small compared to the others, especially as it relates to World War II. And as you can see, I arrived on a beautiful sunny day over Memorial Day weekend in 2018. The American Battle Monuments Commission, supported by the ABMF, has wonderful ceremonies at their various cemeteries during Memorial Day, Veterans Day, as well as key liberation dates. So dates that recognize the liberation of the area or the town will have very important ceremonies with wonderful turnout from the American forces, as well as from the individuals who live nearby or come from foreign military officers and soldiers that come to pay their respects. As you see, here is the 1st Division, their memorial guard here, coming to remember the fallen in 100 years since the end of World War I. So the Somme American Cemetery is a very accessible, beautiful cemetery, and one that was a great one to start with.
One of the things that I always found remarkable at each of these cemeteries is the community support and the display of appreciation that Rich experienced with a cab driver in Vancouver, that I'm always amazed on how many Americans really don't appreciate how much the communities around our cemeteries really do continue to acknowledge and appreciate the service of Americans and the American servicemen, including those buried in their neighborhood.
Absolutely, Jim. And the ABMC and the staff, the American Battle Monuments Commission, as you mentioned, manages 26 overseas cemeteries and a number of monuments. 23 pertain to World War I and World War II. There are approximately 400 people who work with the ABMC directly. Most of them are foreign nationals, and they do an extraordinary job. And Jim, you're referring to the folks who come in to visit and to care and to remember those who have died, but also the staff. Most of the staff of the ABMC are foreign nationals, and they take incredible care of the grounds. As you can see here, I mean, you're just a beautiful final resting place for our fallen heroes, dressed now with the American and French flags. And this was over Memorial Day in 2018. And if we move to the next slide, one of the most poignant reminders or memories that I have of my experience is this little town of Bonnet, just outside within sight. I'm taking this photograph from the Somme American Cemetery. But as I was there early, thanks to the ABMC support and allowing me to get in early and take images, I saw the cemetery being dressed for the memorial event. But what struck me and it was the people that came streaming out of this local town dressed like a wedding, right? And there's a number of pictures in the book that of course, in the interest of time, we don't have to go through all of them, but show the individuals dressed in, suits and beautiful dresses, beautiful outfits to come down and remember and stand there and to remember those who have gave their last measure, their full measure in support of freedom and helping our allies overcome tyranny and obviously years of destruction in their towns and in their communities. We will go from a small cemetery and the first trip, and let's bookend it in the interest of time with the last cemetery I went to visit, which was Manila American Cemetery, right in downtown Manila. It is the largest by total number of individuals memorialized, more than 17,000 interred here. All right, so over twice as many as Normandy, and sadly for those of us in blue, the Navy and the Marine Corps, over twice as many of those interred are on the walls of the missing, including some 36,000 plus individuals listed on the walls of the missing. And you see here the walls of the missing, which seem to go on and on forever. We have the individuals from the Indianapolis, some 800 that were lost. You recall that the Indianapolis was carrying the uranium and material for the atomic bomb. It has a beautiful final resting place for our fallen individuals and heroes. Among the fallen are some of the Philippine Scouts, the resistant movement that was organized and supported by many of the U.S. forces during the periods of Japanese occupation. But one of the reasons that the Manila Cemetery is so large by total in a number of individuals memorialized is that it spans the entirety of the war from 1941 to 1945. That's one of the explanations for so many listed here, not just the fighting in the Philippines, but in the Solomons, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal. These names that are infamous at this stage are those individuals are remembered here in Manila. Can't talk about the American Overseas Cemeteries without talking about Normandy American Cemetery. I had the distinct privilege of visiting Normandy American Cemetery twice, including with the support of the American Battle Monuments Commission, a press pass to arrive at the 75th anniversary. So we just celebrated this year the 80th. So I was there 5 years ago in 2019 for the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. This is probably one of the most impactful photos, the most memorable photos in the book, a panoramic photo of all the veterans that attended. We see some other photos with the individuals posed in the kind of a typical height, maybe a class kind of portrait, couple rows, etc. But I think this is the only one that exists of its kind with all the individuals in the ceremony, lined up side by side.
For the 80th, we had about 202 veterans, and I mean, regrettably, it'll probably be the last time we can get that number of World War II veterans just due to the advancing of age to a 5th or 10th year anniversary. But we had, I think, 14,000 people in attendance, and the ABMF hosted an event for these veterans, plus the congressional delegation, and invited guests of about 1,000, both before and after the ceremony, where both Presidents Macron and Biden spoke. And President Macron awarded 8 Legion d'Honneur to some of the D-Day veterans.
For me, this is one of the most challenging photos to get because of the moment, being here on a journey of gratitude and bringing my cameras along so that I could bring others with me. Nonetheless, it was a journey of gratitude, and having to focus and remember why I was there. I was, there's a weight to, as Jim, you probably can easily attest to. There's a weight to standing near these individuals, these men, these heroes. So it was one of the more challenging emotionally for me to focus and try to get this image when really all I just wanted to do was chat and shake hands with these men, and unfortunately I got a chance to do a bit of that as well.
So no conversation about the 23 World War I and World War II cemeteries would be complete without a discussion of some of the people who are interned there and their stories, because all 234,000 of them have a story lived before they gave their life to the country, and their stories really start with the World War II at Margraten, where the first soldier who was a bombardier, actually with the RAF, but he was a U.S. soldier, lost his life. Rich, do you want to take us through?
The second most visited cemetery of all of the ABMC World War I and World War II cemeteries. And I, again, the opportunity to visit there twice. I had the great fortune to visit there twice. The Netherlands, the Dutch people are incredibly supportive. Was there in cool and then very cold weather, and yet still people stream through and walk through. The Dutch are extraordinarily supportive, and Jim, you can go into that more if you'd like to. The book has 3 parts, and the middle section includes some of the biographies of the fallen, including an airman, that was the first to die in 1942. So one of the extraordinary things that I learned along in the process is that there were a number of our fellow Americans that went ahead of us in World War I or in World War II to help our allies. So in World War I, and we'll talk a little bit maybe about the Cromwell twins later, but many of our troops or our individuals would go ahead and volunteer to help, whether it be in a canteen service or as nurses, or to work with the Royal Air Force or fly for the French or fly for the British. And Charles Earl Summers is one of those. He was an electrical engineer out of Berkeley in California. And in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, raised his hand and joined the Army, first in the Signal Corps, and then was quickly transferred to the Army Air Forces, later to become the United States Air Force. And he was deployed overseas to help the Royal Air Force as a radar specialist at the time. Radar, fairly complex and but an important technology at that stage, right, of aviation, of military aviation. So Summers went over to support the Royal Air Force. Was there for several months in training, and then unfortunately in early 1942, you see a photo here. In fact, it was May, I think. May of 1942, he was on a 6-man sortie looking for U-boats that were attacking convoys, resupplying the French and British and our allies' efforts up in the North Sea. And his plane was hit by flak. Flak is kind of a general term, but it more specifically refers to 88 millimeter weapons, anti-aircraft weapons that shoot metal, essentially explode in metal flies out sort of in a shotgun type of approach. He and his crew members were shot down. Reports were that the aircraft somehow landed in the North Sea, and there were eyewitnesses, including a B-17 bomber mission that saw them on the water, apparently on the one of the wings, hoping and waiting for rescue. Which unfortunately never came. The B-17 crew was in radio silence, reported their what that they saw upon returning, but they were never found at that stage. His body washed up more than a month later in the Netherlands, and here we have Charles Summers' gallantry, bravery, courage. You know, in joining the army even before Pearl Harbor, and unfortunately, he's one of those who lost his life, and is the first individual, first of our American troops to be lost in the European theater in World War II.
Similar to Lieutenant Summers, you mentioned World War One as well. You know, in April of 1916, several Americans who went over to support the war, whether as ambulance drivers or medics or nurses, some were pilots, and some formed what was ultimately called the Lafayette Escadrille, and the Lafayette Escadrille flew Newport 11s and Newport 12s in support of the war. And these are biplanes that, and about 20 minutes outside of Paris, maybe a half hour with traffic, there's a memorial to those fallen. And again, the community around Garches or Marne-la-Coquette, which is, you know, are incredibly supportive. I remember being there on a November day when we dedicated the new visitor center. It was rainy, it was cold. I think if we had such an event here, we wouldn't get anybody to show up there. We had about 247 of the 250 people invited, standing in the rain, listening to the speeches about what came before them. And it was quite moving and representative of why we're doing what we're doing, because really people do appreciate what we did, and all we need to do more of is to let Americans know that the service of people like Rich Sherman is appreciated by Americans, appreciated by the people they protect. Your namesake, but not your relative, Clyde Sherman, is another one who followed his father in service, and father died in 1918. His son Clyde is buried in the Somme American Cemetery.
Right. Yeah. We talked about that being one of the first, or actually is the first cemetery that I visited. And among the first headstones, I think it may be the first 4 or 5 headstones that I happened to walk by as I'm just getting started on this project. You know, I'm be honest, fumbling a bit with my camera gear, getting my focal length set up, understanding how the light's going. And I stop, and there is the headstone of Clyde Sherman. I have no relation to Clyde Sherman, yet by having the same last name, I think it had a very important touch point for me as it related to this entire project. It became much, you know, more things became more intimate with me. Like the biographical section, I think, took shape a lot here mentally for me, which is, you know, I started to wonder more and more, like, who was Clyde Sherman, right? I'm not related to him, but you start to read these headstones and you start to think, what were their lives like? What were their hopes and aspirations? What did they do before the war? Did they have family? Did they have siblings? Did they have, you know, pets, or play sports or whatever? And Clyde Sherman was a steamship clerk in the Midwest before the war. And as you indicated, worked for a number of years on the rivers, and unfortunately was killed in 1918. And while he was in combat, his father passed away just a couple months before he was killed, and so he never had a chance really to come home and say goodbye to his father. And so there's these vignettes, these emotional vignettes that we discover. They all had stories. They all were human beings, and the book is not a history book, as you know, Jim. There are great history books, right? There are, Pulitzer Prize series from Rick Atkinson, or I think we've all read Stephen Ambrose, right? Band of Brothers. There's these unbelievable history books, but this is really a humanist endeavor. The book is designed to remind us that these were individuals, and they deserve more than to be remembered as a statistic or as a battalion or a company. They all had names, they all had families, they all had people who loved them, and they all had hopes of getting back to them. And so the book really, in the middle section here, tries to bring forward their personal personalities, their lives. The biographies include not just the war fighter, as you know, Jim, because when we think of combat, we think of wars, we think of artillerymen and infantrymen and combat pilots and the like. But there are also, as you have alluded to, a number of nurses and doctors and ambulance drivers and chaplains. And chaplains formed a critical role of healing the heart and the soul in very difficult times. And some of them have even some movies have been made about them, but there are a number of chaplains included in
Yeah,
here
I mean,
as well.
right. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Cromwell sisters. I mean, when you talk about these nurses who went to help the wounded, help with the war effort, and before the Americans entered the war, the incredible sacrifice of their Gold Star families. These two sisters who gave their lives in service to the effort, to the war effort, World War One.
Ladies born on the same day and having lost their lives on the same day, they are interred at Somme American Cemetery. Very, very easy, very accessible to get to. Maybe you don't have it in your plans to take the dedicated trip to Normandy, but you certainly can get to Lafayette Escadrille and Suresnes. And if I digress for a moment, Florence is 22 minutes from the Ponte Nicolo in Florence, the Florence American Cemetery, very accessible. But back to Suresnes and the Cromwell twins, very wealthy women in their mid-30s that volunteered for the Red Cross canteen service and deployed in 1918. They went and spent about 8 months helping the French. The French nicknamed them the Twin Angels. As you see here in the image, this is public archive, I think it's National Archives image of them helping the French troops with the Red Cross and the canteen service here. So they served for 8 months supporting the French, and then asked to be transferred to help the American units. And worked for several months in Verdun, of course, an area of great conflict. Well, I won't digress with that statistic, but there is, you're talking between the French, British, and Germans, leaving the Americans out of it, there were over 1.2 million casualties between the Somme and Verdun in World War One. Right, so that's a daunting number, regardless of date, and it's especially daunting at the time in World War One. So anyway, these young ladies volunteered, worked with the French, asked to go forward with the Americans, went to Verdun, and received all kinds of. You can read about them in the book. Received a number of accolades and support from the French, as well as American troops, as well as their fellow Red Cross canteen nurses, canteen workers that you see here. They were asked by their family to come home, yet they continued, and it's well documented that they would work endlessly and tirelessly, and perhaps overwork, as history will reveal, in helping the injured and the hungry troops. And so finally, in January of 1919, right, so we're 3 months roughly after the armistice that ended World War One, they're finally convinced by their brother. My brother, of course, Seymour, went on to be the president of the New York Stock Exchange from 1921 to 1924, but begged by their family to come home. They wanted to see their sisters, And unfortunately, they agreed to embark out of Bordeaux on the steamship La Lorraine to finally come home. Now, there are some writing about this and some research about this show that they were under considerable stress and exhaustion at the time. Gladys was a published poet before the war, and her second book was actually published posthumously. And some of the information comes from one of their teachers who ended up writing the foreword to Gladys's second book, which is simply titled Poems. But anyway, they agreed to get on board, suffering from exhaustion and depression, and were unfortunately by most accounts, or the conclusion, we don't have a diagnosis, but conclusion due to stress or depression, or potentially even use the term PTSD. They both, in the first day after departure from Bordeaux, they both leapt off the side of the ship and plunged to their deaths. And they were recuperated in March of 19, or recovered. The bodies were recovered in March of 1919. And 2 days later, the French gave them or honored them with the Croix de Guerre for their gallantry and service in the war.
Yeah.
So the toll of war, as Jim said, is great on folks, on families, as well as the individuals here. Here we see women with great generosity, born on the same day, and yet the toll of the war weighed heavily on them, and committed suicide. Suicide notes were later found in their cabins.
Some of
And so
the reports say because they were in a very wealthy New York family, very cloistered in their lives, met people that they had never met before at all levels of society, and just couldn't envision going back to the life they left. And through the toils of war and PTSD or whatever the reason, couldn't see them returning to the life they left. Crediting the ABMC for doing this, families like the Ewing families, the Ewing brothers who were pilots, also perished, are buried alongside each other. I think the Roosevelt brothers or family likewise sacrificed more than just one.
Yeah, most of the brothers are side by side, and sometimes it's very daunting. In the book are the three Tester brothers. I mean, it's just unspeakable that imagining that you're receiving a telegram at home once a year that another one of your sons has been killed. And the Tester brothers are in Henri Chapelle, and in a the World War II cemetery, and they died in 43, 44, and 45. The toll on families is enormous. They are the two brothers, Quentin Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt, the youngest and the oldest of the sons, are interred side by side at Normandy American Cemetery. There's Ted Roosevelt Jr. So we'll start with him and then we'll go to his brother. But Ted Roosevelt was 56 years old when he landed in the first wave at Utah Beach on D-Day. Okay, so the oldest, the only general to land in the first wave at D-Day. And he was armed with a pistol and a walking cane. He had been injured 3 times in World War I. He had been gassed, he'd been shot in the leg, almost lost his leg. And here General Roosevelt, a one-star general, Brigadier General Roosevelt, insisted or repeatedly volunteered to be put in with the first wave, and felt that he could be impactful in helping this effort. It was an enormous, as you know from all the history, it was an enormous operation, a very dangerous operation, and one that had a high possibility of failing. So he asked to be put ashore. Now, he had already seen amphibious operations in, for example, Operation Torch in North Africa, when we really kind of got started in the European and North African liberation campaign. Then he went across into Sicily, and then he was served in Italy. He served in Africa under Patton as well. But here he is on D-Day, volunteers to go ashore, and he is. It is a it's one that kind of gets me a bit emotional. Here he is at my age, crisscrossing the beach, armed with essentially a cane. Handguns aren't going to do anything in Normandy. And if you've ever been to Omaha Beach or Utah Beach, you know the handguns aren't effective there. And he would drop down next to soldiers, and you can just imagine the rain of bullets and artillery coming down, and have a word or two with them, encourage them, and then cross the beach to the next soldier. And there's a lot of congestion and traffic jams trying to get vehicles ashore, which was a problem. And the reports are there's a number of reports of him standing up and directing traffic while artillery fire and machine gun fire landed all around him. And so Ted Roosevelt Jr., here he is, a elite family. His father is the former president, Theodore Roosevelt. And here he is now in his 50s, having served in the military since 1917, on and off through the interwar periods. And here he is standing up, walking among the troops, helping them, encouraging them, and keeping the effort going forward. And certainly he inspired his men. Yeah, General Omar Bradley, the famous general, when asked what was the most courageous thing he ever witnessed in the war, he said Ted Roosevelt on Utah Beach. And so Ted survived Utah, got his troops up and off the beach, only to die a couple of weeks later, July 12th, 1944. He had suffered from a number of medical conditions, including a bad heart. Here he is with a heart condition, almost insisting to go ashore at Utah Beach. And he ended up having a heart attack and passed away. That said, he was nominated for a battlefield promotion from his work on Utah Beach. That paperwork never came through in time for him to receive his second star. And he was his wife, Eleanor, received his Medal of Honor in September of 1944 for his actions on Utah Beach. So from a very elite family, but a warrior, and one that the troops adored, and one that had to get into the fight and had to do the best he could. We talk about full measure, and at 56 years old, he inspired a lot of men to pick up and go forward. Quentin Roosevelt was the youngest of Ted Roosevelt, the president's sons, and volunteered for service in 1917, and became an aviator. And the average life expectancy of a World War I aviator was about 21 days. So Quentin Roosevelt deployed overseas with the French, and flew a number of combat missions. Was a daring pilot, seemingly fearless pilot. That's been well documented. He had got his first confirmed kill, I think it was July the 9th, July 9th of 1918. He shot down a enemy aircraft, and just a couple days later, I think it was 5 days later, he was killed. Two bullets pierced his head. His plane went down, and he was killed. POWs, American POWs, American prisoners at the time were nearby, and letters home and reports later after the war indicated there were some 1,000 Germans in attendance for full battlefield honors to bury Quentin Roosevelt once they knew he was the former president's son. Quentin laid there until 1955 in Chamarie, France, where he was interred. There's Quentin until 1955, and then the American Battle Monuments Commission laid him to rest next to his brother Ted Roosevelt at Normandy. So you can go see the Roosevelt brothers if you'd like, at Normandy. One of some almost 11,000 stories at Normandy American Cemetery.
You mentioned George Patton, who, is a household name to most every American, who's also laid to rest at the Luxembourg American Cemetery. I guess he was killed after the war in a Jeep accident.
Yeah, correct. Not much to say about Patton that hasn't already been said, but I think it says a lot that he's interred overseas. Many of the generals and the senior officers, of course, had the option of being brought home from World War II, and Patton was interred with his men at Luxembourg. Of course, that's a critical area where many of the troops fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Some of Patton's greatest success in liberating Easy Company, right? The Band of Brothers, pardon me, and eliminating the Bulge from World War II is right there in those individuals fought in Luxembourg, and so he's interred there. And yeah, you're right. He a lot of a lot has been written about him, but certainly a warrior through and through. And I think very instrumental in the interwar period in modernizing the American tanks. In World War One, technology tends to have a significant impact on the outcomes of wars, whether we talk about tanks in World War One or aviation and unfortunately nuclear weapons in World War II. But the Germans only produced, I think, less than 20 tanks in World War One. They just didn't see the need for it. The tanks they used oftentimes were captured tanks from the French. And of course, anyone who's watched the movie Patton or done a little bit of reading knows Patton was very influential in the Second World War, leading the tank battalions, whether it's in North Africa or into Italy, and then pushing up from the south to eliminate the Bulge in World War II. So he's laid to rest at Luxembourg American Cemetery. And you're right, survived the war and died, I think it was 3 or 4 days before Christmas in 1945.
As history will tell us, that even the fastest men alive couldn't outrun the bullets that were pointed at them. And Floyd Draper, who was a gold medalist, is now interned in the Tunisian cemetery in North Africa.
Yeah, right. So that's a great segue because Patton was, before the First World War, was an Olympian himself. And so Floyd Draper is another Olympian. He's interred in, as you mentioned, in Tunisia in the North Africa American Cemetery. Another cemetery here where we see there are more individuals on the walls of the missing than they are actually buried there due to the amphibious operations coming ashore, and as well as the harsh conditions of desert fighting as well. But Draper, arguably the second fastest man in the world, behind a gentleman named Jesse Owens, ran the 4x100 relay in 1936 in Berlin, which they won. Only like 5 feet. 5 feet 5 inches in stature. There's a picture of him as a gold medal champion in Berlin. Of course, that with three Black Americans, and Foy, who was a white American, could not have made Hitler particularly happy at that. But he was a runner at USC, served as a pilot and in North Africa, and in the Battle of Kasserine Pass, really the pivotal battle to finally chase the Nazis out of North Africa. His plane was lost, and he was. His body was recovered later, and he's interred at North Africa American Cemetery. But just a few short years after winning the gold medal, here, he gave his full measure in another way. He gave his full effort in another way in helping the Americans defeat the Nazis in North Africa. We've spent a lot of time talking about these biographies in the course of today. The biographies form the middle section of the book. The book is broken up into 3 chapters, so I'll just be brief and quick about this. The 3 chapters are designed to take you, because I'm a photographer, an artist, I'm trying to convey a message to you. And so what I tried to do is mimic the feelings that I had when I went to any of these cemeteries, whether it be North Africa or Somme or Manila. And I think you would feel the same way, or maybe Jim, you felt the same way, or Christine, when you've gone to these. Generally, you go in with a positive, affirmative emotion. I don't know if there's a good word for it. Honor, respect, pride, glory. You feel very positive about going there. So the images in the first chapter are very positive and affirmative. Beautiful sunlight, blue skies, soldiers in uniforms, memorial services, flags. because we generally feel very positive about what these individuals did, and sacrificed. The second thing we do when we go into the cemetery is we then start walking through the headstones, right? And so that's what the second chapter is called, A Walk Among the Headstones. And so that's when we read about Clyde Sherman and Quentin Roosevelt. We read their names and their hometowns and when they died. And we start to wonder a little bit about them. So the second chapter, hopefully, I helped to answer a little bit about who they were, in the 54 biographies in the second chapter. And then the last chapter, let me take Normandy, for example. You go through Normandy, you come in one end, you walk out to the other end, you're walking through the headstones. There's Omaha Beach, on generally to your right as you're walking into the cemetery. You can see the cliffs, you can see the ocean. And then you have to then start to make your way out, and you walk row after row after row, and that's just one plot. And you walk again, row after, and you look left, and there's headstones. You look right, there's headstones, and you get through this second series, and you continue to do this. And there's a darkness that kind of overcomes you. And so the third chapter, which I entitled Taps, the images become darker. We get ice and fallen leaves and rain and some, not to be promotional, but some very interesting and I think wonderful images, of the fog at Normandy. And so they become darker, less light, more clouds, darker blacks, because there is this realization that we have as we're leaving. It's like, wow, look at the sacrifice, look at the loss here. I mean, it certainly hits you in the soul. And I would say, because we talked a number of these cemeteries already, if you haven't been, go. If you've gone, go again. But caveat emptor, if you haven't gone, be warned, because it gets into your soul, and you will not walk out feeling the same way as you walk.
Well, that's why we exist, and that's why books like Rich exists. And if we can't, be the megaphone of the great service of the ABMC, to really engage young people, whether it's through the essay contest, whether it's through events, ceremonies, events like today, events like our ambassador series, then we failed in our job, because those memories will only last as long as people like us and those who come after us continue to tell the stories of those who can no longer do so.
How can we say never forget if we haven't taught them in the first place? And that's our responsibility. That's our duty.
We're grateful to that cab driver in Vancouver for inspiring your work. Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, sir.